Committee will come to order. We want to thank our witnesses for being here today for the second in a series of hearings on Russia. This committee is attempting to get a clearer sense of the administration's overall posture on Russia. And again, we thank you both for being here. We have outstanding witnesses today. We'd like to understand what was agreed to when the leaders of our two countries sat down in Helsinki. Were there discussions regarding current or future arms control agreements? What other promises or assurances were made? To date, we have received no real readout, even in a classified setting, of this meeting. We'd like to understand the administration's assessment of the threat posed by Russia to us, to our allies, and to other countries and institutions around the world. Finally, we need a better understanding of how Russia's sanctions, this committee wrote last year, and the Senate passed by a vote of 98-2 despite strong objections from the White House, are being implemented. Russia has annexed Crimea, occupied parts of Georgia, interfered with elections, including our own, violated the INF Treaty, remains in violation, used chemical weapons to poison individuals in the United Kingdom, and even purportedly hacked U.S. utilities. These offenses are bad enough, but they leave us wondering, what's next? What does the administration expect that they will next do? The past teaches us that even worse things may lay just over the horizon if we fail to push back now and make clear to President Putin that our nation is united from the very top to the bottom and standing against his destabilizing behavior, both in policy and in public posture.
Assad's murderous regime and Iranian proxy fighters inching closer towards Israel rely on the Kremlin. And today, we learned from Microsoft that Russian hackers continue their attempts to attack the United States Senate and venerable American think tanks and NGOs.
We are calling you from Microsoft Service Center. And this call is about your computer, okay?
Okay.
Yeah, and the reason we are calling you because from your computer, we have been receiving some errors and warning reports.
Oh, really? Like what?
Like the warning reports are saying that the firewall of your computer is not working.
I have been disappointed by the calls by some on the other side of the aisle to ignore these threats and seek accommodation with Moscow. Sending mixed signals to the Kremlin and its allies only serves to undermine our pressure track and sanctions regime. I do not currently see the value in meeting with sanctioned members of the Russian Duma. They are sanctioned because of their support for the illegal annexation of Crimea, and they should remain on our sanctions list until Crimea is returned to Ukraine. I myself am sanctioned by the Russian government for my authorship of the Ukraine Freedom Support Act, and I'd be happy to meet with the Duma when each of the goals of that law are accomplished. Till then, they can stay in Moscow. I'd like to use this hearing to look forward. The administration often points to its record while ignoring the president's damaging rhetoric on Russia policy. With that said, I was pleased that Secretary Pompeo committed to work with us on new sanctions, as outlined in my bill with Senator Graham and many others on this committee. Today, I'd like to hear in detail specific provisions of the Defending American Security from Kremlin Aggression Act of 2018 that you'd commit to working towards. I want your views on how these measures could impact the Kremlin's decision-making calculus and how the sanctions the bill imposes would impact the intended targets. The bill recognizes that our efforts to date have been insufficient. It includes tough measures which we recognize have implications for U.S. companies and our allies. Do we really believe it is acceptable or in our national interest for U.S. companies or those of our allies to be doing business in Russia, particularly supporting the very sectors that have aided and abated Kremlin's aggression and interference? It's utterly ridiculous that President Trump would publicly champion a U.S.-Russia business council rather than condemn the Kremlin's outright aggressions. Second, I want to hear how you would support provisions to deepen cooperation with Europe on Russia sanctions implementation. Our sanctions regime is only as effective as our ability to convince Europe to increase the pressure. Third, I continue to believe that our government is not properly constituted to address the hybrid threat posed by Russia. Our bill would establish a national fusion center to address malign influence and hybrid threats, and also calls for the establishment of a sanctions coordinator office within the Senate.
First witness is Wes Mitchell, Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, U.S. Department of State. Again, we thank you for being here and appreciate what you do for our country. Our second witness is Mr. Marshall Billingsley, Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing, U.S. Department of Treasury. We thank you for the same. We appreciate the fact you're sharing your thoughts and viewpoints with us today.
I will use my prepared comments today to outline in brief form the overarching strategy of the United States towards the Russian Federation. The foundation for this strategy is provided by three documents, as directed and approved by the President: the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and the Russia Integrated Strategy. The starting point of the National Security Strategy is the recognition that America has entered a period of big power competition and that past U.S. policies have neither sufficiently grasped the scope of this emerging trend nor adequately equipped our nation to succeed in it. The central aim of the administration's foreign policy is to prepare our nation to confront this challenge by systematically strengthening the military, economic, and political fundaments of American power. Our Russia policy proceeds from the recognition that to be effective, U.S. diplomacy must be backed by military power that is second to none and fully integrated with our allies in all of our instruments of power. To that end, we have reversed years of cuts to the defense budget, begun the process of recapitalizing the U.S. nuclear arsenal, requested close to $11 billion for the European Deterrence Initiative, and worked within NATO to bring about more than $40 billion in new European defense spending. At the NATO summit, we established 2 new NATO commands, including one here in the United States, new counter-hybrid threat response teams, and major multi-year initiatives to bolster the mobility, readiness, and capability of the alliance. Our strategy is animated by the realization that the threat from Russia has evolved beyond being simply an external or military one. It includes influence operations orchestrated by the Kremlin in the very heart of the Western world. These activities are extensively resourced and directed from the highest levels of the Russian state. It's important to state clearly what these campaigns are and are not about. What they're not about is a particular attachment to U.S. domestic political causes. They're not about right or left, not about American political philosophy. As the recent Facebook purges reveal, the Russian state has promoted fringe voices on the political left and right, including groups who advocate violence, the storming of federal buildings, and the overthrow of the U.S. government. Russia foments and funds controversial causes, and then foments and funds the causes opposed to those causes. Putin's thesis is that the American Constitution is an experiment that will fail if it is challenged in the right way from within. Putin wants to break apart the American Republic. Not by influencing an election or two, but by systematically inflaming the fault lines within our society. Accepting this fact is absolutely essential for developing a long-term response to the problem. The most dangerous thing in the world we could do is politicize the challenge, which in itself would be a gift to Putin. What Russian efforts are about is geopolitics, the Putinist system's permanent and self-justifying struggle for international dominance. As stated by a handbook of the Russian armed forces, the goal is to, quote, carry out mass psychological campaigns against the population of a state in order to destabilize society and the government and force that state to make decisions in the interests of its opponents. Doing so involves an evolved toolkit of subversive statecraft, first employed by the Bolshevik and later the Soviet state, upgraded for the digital age. The State Department takes this threat very seriously. Countering it in both overt and covert form is among the highest priorities of the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. As a co-chair of the Russian Influence Group, I work with General Scaparrotti to bring the combined resources of EUR and EUCOM to bear against this problem. Under EUR leadership, all 49 U.S. missions located in Europe and Eurasia are required to develop, coordinate, and execute tailored action plans for rebuffing Russian influence operations in their host countries. Within the Bureau, we recruited one of the architects of the Global Engagement Center legislation from the staff of a member of this committee. We formed a new position, the Senior Advisor for Russian Malign Activities and Trends, or SARMAT, to develop cross-regional strategies across offices. EUR created a dedicated team to take the offensive in publicly exposing Russian malign activities, which since January of this year has called out the Kremlin on 112 occasions. We are now working with our ally, the UK, to form an international coalition for coordinating efforts in this field and have requested over $380 million in security and economic assistance accounts in the President's 2019 budget. We recognize that Congress has an important role to play in providing the tools and resources needed to deal effectively with the Russian problem set. As Secretary Pompeo made clear in his recent testimony, we're committed to working with all of you to make headway against this problem and align our efforts in support of the President's Russia strategy. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for inviting me today. I look forward to your questions.
At the outset, I will say that those of us in the Treasury Department share the views that you and the ranking member and many in the Senate have expressed regarding the significant and continuing national security threat posed to the United States by the Russian Federation. Continuing occupation of Crimea, paramilitary operations in Ukraine, human rights abuses, malicious cyber attacks on U.S. and allied infrastructure and companies, illicit procurement of restricted U.S. technologies, violation of crucial arms control treaties, support to the Assad regime's barbarism, assassination of dissidents and defectors, including the unconscionable use of the Novichok nerve agent in London, in the United Kingdom, and ongoing efforts to interfere in our sacrosanct election processes and those of our allies are just some of the unacceptable behaviors of the Putin regime. Countering Russian aggression is a top priority for the Treasury Department, and consequently the net effect of our actions over the past year and a half is an unprecedented level of financial pressure mounted against the Kremlin, its oligarch proxies, and key sectors of the Russian economy.
The combined effect of our sanctions, together, by the way, with our larger defense establishment, is a cost imposition strategy. And I think it's important to remember that cost imposition is what won the Cold War. So I would argue that, very clearly, by increasing the costs in these sectors for the Russian economy and state, but also forcing them to up their game in developing military technological advances to keep pace with the United States in both conventional and nuclear arms, I think we're absolutely having an impact on Vladimir Putin's preferred strategy.
Let me ask you both, do you support the establishment of a national fusion center to coordinate policy against malign actors across or the whole of government? Let me ask you both, do you support the establishment of a national fusion center to coordinate policy against malign actors across or the whole of government?
I think there is something to the idea of a mechanism for increasing coordination within government It's a problem that has a lot of different aspects. There's a cyber and technical aspect. There's a diplomatic and messaging aspect. There's an informational aspect. My caveat would be, I think it's important to go about this in a way that does not get in the swim lane of current lines of effort, which I would argue are doing a good job.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me start by reiterating what the Chair and Ranking Member both said about both of you. I'm glad you're there. And I thought that you gave us a sober but very thoughtful and fact-based presentation today. My questions to you are really about why, given all the things we are doing, including sanctions, are we not making better progress? Specifically, I'd like you, Secretary Mitchell, to talk a little bit about the Global Engagement Center. There was talk about a new fusion center. I'm not necessarily against that, but we just set up this Global Engagement Center. Senator Murphy and I spent a lot of time on legislation over the years working on this. The idea there was to, at least with regard to pushback on the disinformation and propaganda, be able on an interagency basis to be able to have better coordination and be more effective in pushing back. We have, frankly, much less resources than the Russians use every day here in Washington, D.C. even. But could you talk a little about that or other ways we could deal with what is obviously a continuing problem with Russia?
Thank you for those questions, Senator. Let me just respond in brief to the three things you've asked. On the first part, I'm not sure I would characterize the efforts that we've made in quite the way that you have in terms of impact. I think the chilling effect on the Russian economy and certainly key sectors has been significant and measurable. Since 2013, foreign direct investment in Russia has fallen by 80%, which is a pretty stunning number. You know, at this point, we're looking at an impact through the chilling effect of use of 231 from CATSA of $8 to $10 billion in foreclosed arms deals. I think your broader point on Putin and his view of the United States not having a partisan axe to grind is apt. I don't think that Putin is a student of Jefferson or Adams. I think he's a student of Haushofer. I think it's about geopolitics. I think Microsoft revelations from yesterday show that. Facebook expulsions show that very clearly, that the groups in question were fomenting violence from a fringe left perspective. So I think that we have to understand that we have a competitor who sees this as strategic competition, and his interest is in dividing us internally. It's a strategy of chaos for strategic effect. And so I think it's incumbent on us to not politicize and make it partisan. In terms of GEC, we work very closely with GEC. As you probably know, the department has put $20 million of our own resources towards this effort in the period when we're waiting on the additional funds. We're really looking forward to seeing our colleagues at Department of Defense move the additional $40 million so that we can see the GEC be up and running in the way that it was intended in the areas related to Russian disinformation.
Do you feel like you have the right staff on board at GEC to be able to punch back?
I do. I think we have a very talented staff, some very capable and knowledgeable Russia hands. We also work very closely with them from our bureau. In fact, when our colleagues in Russia were PNG'd and came back, we made excellent use of the talent base to do a temporary plus-up in some of those areas. I mentioned the capacities that we've created at EUR, including the SARMAT role. SARMAT is the acronym for this person's role. It's also the acronym for a Russian missile. think it makes the point very clearly that we take the problem seriously.